So Juan, now let's talk about the hearing. We've talked about the documents, we've talked about how to utilize the time in terms of preparing everything, bundling documents. That's a lot of information. Now let's talk about the hearing. What happens at the hearing?
Yeah, what happens at the hearing, and some tips as well on how to behave, how to speak, how to present your arguments at the hearing, and in a calm manner. And let's dive into this.
So first and foremost, formalities. What are the formalities at the ART?
So obviously you're going to see that there is a time in which obviously everyone enters the room. You're going to have a brief introduction of who the member is going to be, who's going to be hearing your case. And first, the member will read out all the eligibility criteria that is going to be the context of your case.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned previously that it's important that you do your homework and you understand what the actual eligibility criteria is, because if the members explain to you what the issue is in your case, but what you're thinking about is that it's not fair that I wasn't granted a visa, you're on two different pages. The member is talking about what the issue is as to why you're here today. Generally, the member will be fairly helpful just in terms of explaining these are the issues, that's how I'm going to ask the questions. And you really do need to be paying attention in terms of how the questions are going to be asked, because every hearing is a little bit different. You might be asked to give an opening statement. Maybe the member will ask you to clarify why you provide particular documents. So there's no real formula as such. It does take a little bit of time to go through the preliminaries, which is the formalities or the introduction, before you get to the hearing. So normally the first half an hour is spent on the formalities.
It's important to remain calm. I think a lot of people think this is a very scary situation and experience, and that's very understandable. But remember to remain calm. Just look what's happening, listen to what's happening at that specific moment of the introduction of the hearing, and be ready for the conversation.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's important to be comfortable with silence. What I tend to notice is, let's say if a member is taking down notes, they're silent because they're taking down notes, and you're silent, and you almost feel like you need to talk. But this is a hearing, so unless you ask the question, don't assume what the question is. Don't create a question as well. That's what happens as well. You kind of get nervous and you start to create questions because you feel like you need to talk. But really you don't. You just have to sit there and wait for the next steps, which is very nerve-wracking, but that's the process.
So the way to see the hearing, it's like a conversation. Like imagine you're speaking about your case, about what happens. It's we can say it's that relaxed in a way. Like there is not that tension that people tend to believe. Oh, it's going to be super awkward and tense. It's actually like an invitation to speak about what happened in your case. Why you believe you should.
The members are trained, especially in sensitive cases like refugee, to be able to make the applicant feel a bit more calm and be able to present the case. But also with that, so the member tries to make you calm and ensure that you understand the instructions, but you also have to come in prepared, because if you have no idea what you're going to talk about, doesn't matter how calm the hearing is, it's just not going to work out for you if you have no idea why you're there.
Yeah, and this is why in our previous episode we were making a lot of emphasis on the preparation. Be prepared. Even for this conversation, you have to be prepared. Otherwise, it's going to be a little bit awkward if you don't know what's happening and how to put your case forward.
Yeah, and I think the best example is you definitely want the visa. That's why you're there. So I don't think you need to state that. But it's more about, do you meet the regulations? Do you meet the regulatory criteria for that visa?
And this is our next point. So obviously there's going to be a conversation of why you are or aren't eligible. Obviously you're going to be speaking why you're eligible, and so you're going to know the law again. We want to refresh and put more emphasis on this. Know your eligibility. Know the applicable law. If it is a protection visa, know the definitions, know what are the protection obligations. If it is student visa refusal, know the structure of the eligibility. For example, financials, you're being genuine, cost of preparation, etc.
That's super important, and also understand where there might be a few plot holes as well. You may not satisfy every criteria 100%, but that's not what you're there for. You're there to address every criteria, and there might be, you may be stronger in certain points, and that's completely okay, as long as you're able to address it. if you don't know something, it's important that you don't just leave it out, because what will happen is the member will raise that at the end and say, for example, let's say if you don't know what complementary protections are, protection obligations, and you don't raise them, the member will say, well, you haven't brought any complementary protection obligations, so I'm not going to assess them. So it will come back to you because they've got their script. So just because you haven't brought that up, it doesn't mean that it will go away.
Right, so the member will ask you questions. Question about what happened, the facts, your time here in Australia, etc. So be prepared to answer these questions, in a calm manner. And what sort of questions is the member going to ask for us?
Yeah. Well, look, the questions are going to be open-ended questions, meaning questions that will get you to answer the question in full and provide as much detail as possible, and will link back to the regulation. So going back to complementary protections, obligations, or maybe sort of specific protection obligations, the member might ask you a question around specific incident. What happened on this particular date, and they would be looking at to see how you tell the story, whether you're being specific. If you mention that you've been injured or someone harmed you, they will ask you who that was or how it happened, and then they will go on and also ask for any evidence. So it kind of leads from one question to the other. What the member is trying to do is they're trying to understand what these documents are that you've provided. So the questions will be around your documents.
So know your story from beginning to end. Know what happened and how to answer every question that the member could ask.
And I think just on top of that as well, try not to assume what the question's asking. Again, it's very tempting if you get asked a question and you didn't anticipate that question, you answer it in a different way. Either answer the question or say you don't know what the answer is. Try not to make up the answer, because that will be very detrimental to your case. It shows that you don't understand what the case theory is. Our next point is a little bit difficult to exercise in practice, but it is important that you do remain calm. Like I said before, the member will normally give you an introduction in terms of how the hearing is going to be. So by the time you get through a couple of questions, your nerves should settle down. But if you just feel that you might be a little bit too nervous, you can ask for a break. If English is not your first language, or you feel that you're struggling, it is important that you ask for an interpreter. Sometimes having an interpreter in the background just relaxes your nerves a little bit, and really just focus on the question. That's what's going to make you calm. Where you get into a state of anxiety is when you're trying to sort of almost figure out why the question's being asked. Don't worry too much about that. Focus on the questions being asked.
Yeah, and what's important to bear in mind is that they direct the hearing. You're not going to feel alone, or lost, or ever feeling that you have to direct how everything's going to happen. The member usually, makes the question, gives you the opportunity to speak. So you, at all times you're gonna know what's happening.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to make. You don't have to lead your case. So that's the I suppose the contrast between the courts. If you take the case to a court, you have to direct the hearing. So as soon as you get up, whatever you say goes. At the tribunal, it's opposite. It's the other way around. The member will direct the hearing. So your job is to listen and to answer the questions.
So the whole conversation happened. The whole discussion happened. I wanna give a very good tip. If you feel that in the middle of the conversation and the arguments there was something that you could not prove with a document at that specific moment, you can request the member to give you the opportunity to provide that document later.
Yeah, and that's a really good tip as well. And sometimes if that what can happen is, let's say you start talking about something and it becomes important to your case, and the member might say, do you have a document to prove that? You might not have it on the day, and the member might say, okay, well, why don't you send that document into the tribunal? So the document is important. If the member feels that it's important, they will ask you for it. They're not just going to say, well, it's too bad that you don't have it. They will say, okay, please send me that document when you can. Now, once you get to the end of the hearing, it really just depends on how the hearing went. If everything's been covered, the member might say, well, thank you for your time. We'll be in touch shortly. Don't stress too much if that happens. It just means that everything that should have been covered has been covered. If the hearing was particularly long and there was a lot of issues covered, the member might ask you to do what's called a closing submission. So that's an opportunity for you to be able to repeat your case again. Obviously not from start to finish. You've got to limited number of time that's available to you. So you would just recite essentially what you had in your statement. Try to use that opportunity. Like I said, if it's not given to you, it means everything's been covered sufficiently. If it is given to you, don't say that you're going to decline that opportunity, because it is being asked for a reason. If the closing submission wasn't required, the member wouldn't be asking you to make one.
And yeah, so after the hearing has concluded, what happened after? Obviously, wait for a decision.
Yeah, and that's a hard part. Your members understand that it's very difficult to be waiting for a decision, and they try to get them out as soon as possible, but it just depends on the complexity of the case and the issues that were raised. And when the decision comes, hopefully it will go in your favour, meaning that if it's a visa cancellation, it will be revoked, or if it's a visa refusal, it goes back to Home Affairs for reassessment. If it is a negative decision, it may be possible to appeal the case, but you would be appealing on very different grounds, and that would be to the courts, and that carries a very different legal criteria. But again, it's important that you focus on the hearing as opposed to all the hypotheticals of what might happen if you get a negative decision, because you want all of your attention to be channeled towards the hearing as opposed to what happens if you don't get a positive decision. There's a lot of information on forums where people say, I went to the hearing and it wasn't good. Then someone with a similar story might have went to a hearing and it was actually good. It just differs because everyone's circumstances are very different. So focusing on the actual hearing as opposed to the possible outcome is probably more helpful.
So it is possible to represent yourself?
It is possible to represent yourself. I think it's a little bit harder, if I'm going to be very honest with you. It's a little bit like, I suppose, doing your own taxes and maybe doing your own conveyancing. It's possible. It's probably even possible to build your own house if you wanted to, but but it's also important to understand that you need to know the technicalities. So we've talked about that hearings are informal, but there are formal practice directions in place, and if you don't follow those and you don't know what they are, the sad situation is that you might actually have a case, but it won't be in your favour because you haven't followed something. So when in doubt, you can always seek legal advice. You don't necessarily have to engage legal advice at the start of the hearing. What we find sometimes is maybe someone takes on a case, it becomes too hard, and just before the hearing we get engaged. That happens quite often, so that's completely fine as well. But it is possible. You'll just need to do a lot of homework beforehand if you haven't done this sort of work before.